This week on To the Contrary.
First, the Pope versus Obamacare. Then, legislating against the pay gap. Behind the headlines, gender equality in theater.
Welcome to the Contrary, a discussion of news and social trends from diverse perspectives. Up first, the Pope's visit to America.
Pope Francis is known for his progressive rhetoric, but he may have upset some on the left during his American visit, as well as some on the right. The left, because he showed support through an unscheduled visit with a group of nuns fighting the Affordable Care Act's birth control rule. The right, because he urged congressional Republicans in his address to Congress to fight climate change. The Obamacare problem arose because the law requires employers, including churches and Catholic schools, to buy health insurance with birth control coverage. Religious organizations can file for exemptions, but the Order of Nuns, called the Little Sisters of the Poor, see that as an undue burden. They're suing the White House, and their case is headed to the Supreme Court. Not all pro-choice Catholics oppose the Pope's meeting. Sarah Hutchinson-Ratcliffe of Catholics for Choice sees it as a positive.
Pope Francis uses symbolism a lot. The symbol of the Pope stopping by to give support to the Little Sisters of the Poor is not, I wouldn't say disappointing. It's just, I think it's a symbol, and it's one that he felt he needed to do, probably because he didn't deliver the messages that the bishops would have liked to have him do.
The Pope faced criticism for his comments about clergy sexual abuse that rocked the church. Survivors groups were upset because the pontiff praised the American bishop's bravery in the fallout and was widely expected to set a last-minute meeting in Philadelphia with survivors of sexual abuse still loyal to the church.
What we're looking for from Pope Francis is for him to take concrete action. Like, we believe he should open up those records in the Vatican and turn them over to police. And we think that he should order every bishop in the country to do the same.
So, Mary Rice Hasson, welcome to the panel. And will the Pope's visit lure more American Catholic women back into the fold?
I wouldn't say lure, but I would say attract and invite. He's the Pope of arms wide open. So
I think that he's the people's Pope, and I think that he's opening up the church to a lot of people. So I wouldn't be surprised if more women come back.
Right. The Pope is reaching out to people whose views are generally incongruous with the Catholic Church because he's chosen to wade into these non-traditional areas like climate change and immigration.
I'm a woman. I'm a Christian. I'm sold.
Okay, there you go. But apparently, before we get to what he did on, tangentially on abortion rights and in terms of the victims of sexual abuse, let's get to the resignation of House Speaker John Boehner. What does that mean, and why did it happen the day after his speech to Congress? And were members of Congress listening about reconciling?
I think the message of reconciliation may have been part of that, but I think also Boehner really wanted the Pope to be there. That was a dream for 20 years, and that occurred, and why not go out on a high note? There's been a lot of talk about him leaving, so.
I think that Boehner I think his exit signals the fact that we're headed towards a government shutdown. And I think the Republicans are gearing up for the fight against Planned Parenthood. I'm not sure that the Pope's message fell on open ears. And so I think that Boehner exiting, there are rumblings. Something is about to occur.
Do you think, in terms of the fight over Planned Parenthood and Boehner's exit, was it the Tea Party members of Congress who want a government shutdown? Should they have been listening to the Pope's message and reconciling somehow? Or should the supporters of Planned Parenthood have been listening and willingly gone along with defunding it?
You know, it's an interesting juxtaposition to have that message from the Pope of reconciliation at the same time that you're having this fight over funding for abortions, which, as we know, Pope Francis and the Catholic Church stands very strongly against. So it's hard to know which of those teachings should be elevated more, but certainly by all accounts, meeting the Pope was a major moment in John Boehner's life. So perhaps you're right that he did want to go out on a high note, and that had something to do with at least the timing of his announcement.
Was it destructive timing, as far as you're concerned, in terms of the Pope's message of reconciling?
I think it's revealing timing, all right? I think it's systemic, symptomatic timing. And I would argue, as I always do, the Republican Party only has 6% of its legislators are women, compared to 30% on the Democratic side. And I think that's the causation for this stranglehold, this sort of partisan chest thumping that consistently comes from that side of the fence, this consistent sort of, people call it the war on women. I argue with that. I don't agree with that term. But if we simply had more women on the right, John Boehner wouldn't be threatened the way he has been and wouldn't be stepping down, in my opinion.
Okay, and what about the survivors of pre-sexual abuse?
Right.
They, as you saw, were not at all pleased with what the Pope did. He was, as we reported earlier, widely expected to lay on a last-minute meeting with survivors, but those would be not the ones who were asking for what the woman we interviewed is asking for, but those who sympathize still, support the church despite what they went through.
Right. The Pope's a pastor, so I would not be surprised if he does meet with survivors. But his comments to the bishop were really to the bishops when he spoke to them about what they'd been through. He was acknowledging the fact that the Catholic Church has made huge changes, more than any other institution really in society, to address this issue. And that's come not without cost, both financial, but in terms of dealing with the people and needing to really be upfront about that. And he's acknowledging that and saying, you've been doing the right thing. So he's a pastor to them as well.
I mean, I think that there's a lot of work that still needs to be done within the Catholic Church for people. I mean, we know that the number of Catholics is going up, but the number of people that are actually attending church is down. And I still think that there's a lot of healing that needs to happen there. And I'm not sure if the Pope just meeting with survivors will send a message, or what else needs to be done that's significant around policy.
Which survivors, right? I mean, if he were to meet with the SNAP folks who are demanding much more action by the church versus survivors who say, yes, I survived, I'm still a loyal Catholic, that's a whole different group of people.
It is a whole different group of people, and I think it would be in the Catholic Church's best interest for it to meet with both. I think I don't think that it's fair to just say that you have these victims and they say, well, I'm still loyal to the church even though I was abused. That doesn't send a good message, and I think that for those people who have been abused and they want real serious action, he needs to find some place in the middle to moderate those two states in order to bring the Catholic Church back together again.
But I'd push back against that in the sense that the church has made great strides. They've just done things that, again, your public schools don't even do in terms of protecting children. So it's not a question of waiting for something else to be done. It's time to close the books on this and say, things have been taken care of. The church is attuned to this. They are reaching out. Let's move on and get about the business of really taking care of people.
But what about doctrine? I mean, and I know it applies more to the Planned Parenthood situation than it does, for example, to the situation with survivors of sexual abuse. But are we going to see any change in doctrine that matches some of this Pope's very progressive rhetoric?
Well, there isn't any doctrine that's implicated in terms of the survivors of sexual abuse, because those were not problems of celibacy related to marriage. Those were pedophilia problems, or they were homosexuality problems with older teens, and that was proven by the John Jay study. So putting that aside, I think a lot of people love the Pope's rhetoric and his welcome to people to say, come on in, let's discuss. You have a problem with the church's stance on divorce, on contraception, abortion, come on in, come on back. But don't look for a change in doctrine, because that's not going to happen. The church feels that it received the truth, and it guards it as it is.
And if I could, Mary, I would agree with much of what you're saying, but I disagree with the idea that we should close the books on this issue. As a survivor of sexual abuse myself, what I'm impressed with is, I think you hit the nail on the head. The Pope is acknowledging that progress has been made. He's acknowledging that these survivors exist. What I love about this Pope is he puts Christ in the front seat and church dogma in the trunk. And I love that about him.
When you say that, what do you mean? And
here's a man who has taken his oath of poverty very seriously. You know, so gone is sort of the Pope-mobile kind of, right? He takes very seriously his role as the most important religious leader in the world, right? He takes it very seriously, and he takes his role modeling very seriously, which is why I think he's upsetting people on the left and right. He is taking that role as a leader and a role model very seriously, and as a Christian Protestant, I'm just very, very grateful to see the doctrine of Christ as told in the New Testament worn by the leader of the religious faith.
But a lot of Catholics and former Catholics are saying, how important is all that if dogma is not changed, if dogma and doctrine don't go along? The rest of it's all public relations, in a way, is what's being said.
And that's part of the duty of the Pope, is to be a pastoral leader, but also to safeguard doctrine that's been in place for thousands of years. I mean, that's part of his official role. And so his outreach to progressives and the fact that he is bridging the divide between people who have stood against the Catholic Church, that goes to the healing of the damage that has been done by all of these scandals. But at the end of the day, it's still his duty to protect the doctrines that have stood. It's what the Catholic Church stands for.
Well said. Yeah, doctrines will not change, but he's saying, come on in.
Come on
all
in.
are welcome.
All right. And Mary Rice Hasson, thank you so much.
Thanks
Sorry
for
for getting your name wrong earlier.
Right. Yeah.
And thank you so much for
Thank
joining
you.
us for this. Let us know what you think. Please follow me on Twitter at Bonnier Bay. From the Pope to the pay gap.
California is about to get one of the nation's toughest laws aimed at closing the pay gap. Under the new law, employers who face claims of gender discrimination will have to prove there's a legitimate reason, such as seniority or merit, for wage differences if men and women are doing substantially similar work. Current California law requires equal pay for the same exact job. The new measure also protects employees from retaliation for talking with coworkers about what they earn. Pay secrecy is an important element in closing the pay gap. Last year, President Obama signed executive orders that bar federal contractors from retaliating against employees who talk about their wages, and directing the Department of Labor to collect wage data from federal contractors.
So, Jennifer Higgins, welcome to the panel. Thank you very much. California's move, good or bad?
I think it's interesting.
A little more?
Right. No, I think at the end of the day, I think Republicans are looking at this as just like every other bill in Congress right now that's moving forward on paycheck fairness, and an opportunity to advance the conversation and to build on something around retaliation and transparency.
Okay. And is this enough?
I think it's a fantastic move. I love the fact that California is leading on this issue. I don't understand why why equal pay is still a conversation that we're having in 2015. Why we don't understand that having women and men make the same amount of money for the same jobs is good for our economy and good for families. I don't see why that is an issue that we continue to face.
A lot of Republicans might argue that it's not an issue, that the fact that the pay gap exists can be attributed to other factors, and that we're legislating away a problem that might not even exist. And that's the reason why, Republicans might stand opposed to it, although this California bill has sort of sailed through without much opposition.
Hey, this is the hot button issue of our day when it comes to women's rights, right? When you see Patricia Arquette coming out there right in front in the Emmys, and Meryl Streep levitating off her seat when she speaks, right? The thing I like about this is I think it's a great example of what government's here for in the first place. The 19th Amendment, it took 150 years to pass that darn thing, and it's been almost 100 years since it's been passed. So I applaud California. They're usually leading the charge. They're the first ones that made us all wear seatbelts. If they're the first ones to make sure that women get paid even, I'm with it.
Well, New York and California, quite frankly, have been, in terms of states and in terms of moving laws to the left, to the more progressive side, they both lead, and the court, their state Supreme Courts are leaders as well, but substantially similar. How important is that, and how much is that going to, in a way, gum up the works, because it's a very hard term to prove.
Legislation is like sausage making, right? This is all real tough stuff, right? What I love about the term is, for a long time we've hid behind the fence, right, of, well, it's not exactly the same job, right? To your point, Mary, right? Sarah, excuse me. So I actually like the term. I think it's taking us a little bit farther down the field of saying, listen, I had the pleasure, quite frankly, of getting to know, and I call her on her cell phone, Lily Ledbetter. How long did she work on that legislation, right? And how hard was it for her to find out what everybody else earned, right? So I think more, to your point, Jen, more transparency in the workplace here. It's a tough nut, though, because America is the nation of business. That's what we're great at, right? So we don't want to put things that are unnecessarily onerous in the way of businesses so they don't thrive the way they should. But we got to take care of this issue.
Well, Sarah, I think Sarah made a great point, and Sam, you do as well. I think what's important here is that Republicans aren't necessarily opposed in any way to the idea of equal pay, I think the bigger factor for us is that there are laws currently in place that allow for that, and I think the discrimination question of what is discrimination, there are a number of other factors that go into decision-making about equal pay, and I think we're looking at exploring those. I know that Kelly Ayotte has a bill called the GAP Act that's looking at that, and I think for us as Republicans looking to empower states to take the initiative to look at these things and to provide a greater understanding of what the gender pay disparities are, how those work, what those mechanisms are, because we don't have a lot of those answers right now. And hopefully over time we can build on some things like California with respect to non-retaliation and with respect to transparency. But to your point, businesses are leading this effort as well. Tech companies are taking initiatives in terms of transparency. So we would like to see those efforts and continue and persist rather than adding on top of that additional mandates.
But let me ask you, is this a change among conservative and Republican women? Because the standard response from Republican women 10 or more years ago was there is no pay gap, or if there's a pay gap, it's because women choose to stay home with their kids, they choose to take care of their parents, and so they know that they're going to, and actually they disputed Labor Department figures about whether the pay gap was real or something women were choosing.
Well, I think you're looking at an acknowledgement by Republicans that we do have to evaluate these things more closely. And as you're looking at the changing family and the changing workplace, we have to acknowledge that more and more women are taking time away to be with their families. And how do we acknowledge that in terms of a labor force? And how do we recognize that through child care initiatives, through paid leave initiatives? And I think for the first time you're seeing an opening in the Republican Party, a lot having to do with the presidential election and Hillary's engagement and our need as a party to be more engaged in the women's issues.
I would argue that
but you should, just a second, you should be celebrating that as a revolution, because it's a big change.
It's significant, and it's a step in the right direction. I'm not saying we're there yet, but I think it's a step in the right direction.
But if I can, what I think also is going on here, not as maybe a little less fundamentally, but to your point, Jen, is that there's a huge overarching economic benefit if there's more money in the pockets of these households, and that's a massive benefit. So I think that's part of what's going on here too.
And to Jen's point, I think that it's really important that we look at all of the different pieces that add to equal pay or unequal pay, such as childcare, such as creating an environment where women don't have to leave the workforce in order to take care of kids, because there is no because childcare costs are just so high that it makes more sense for them to leave and then lose that time in the workplace. So I think it's not a siloed issue. It is very much a quilt of things that we need to look at as a one whole picture in order to address the issue.
But Sarah Westwood, and a belated welcome to the panel to you as well. You're doing a great job, and thank you for participating. Do you see it that way?
It's about striking a balance between something that doesn't place unnecessary burdens on businesses that would erase any benefit that potentially marginally higher wages would create, and still looking at these issues like transparency, like child care, that matter. And to Jen's point, these are issues we see come up during election years because it turns people out to voters, but doesn't necessarily have a major impact on the economy overall, and that you do unfortunately see fade away on the off years.
And if I could, globally, we're the only nation in the developed world where women are slowly exiting out of the workforce relative to other countries. And the thing that people continually point to is this lack of adequate child care provisions for women. It's too hard and it's too expensive. So I think we have to look at the global perspectives on this one too.
Is that one where the Republican Party is
There's a lot of brainstorming going on, and I think that's important. I think if you look at opportunities not only, as we talked about, on the leave side, but also ways to sort of prop up and support that social contract that we have with families. And as the Party of Family Values, it's a commitment on our part. Besides following, we need to start leading on these issues.
Can I just point out, I want to elect Jen president?
Right. No, but seriously, I mean, why is it that there is this change going on? Is it polling?
Well, I think you're finding more Republican
voters?
women. We talked about this earlier, actually. I think the number of Republican women in Congress, and I think the number of Republican women who have faced these issues, whether that's Martha Roby or Cathy McMorris Rodgers, others, they've experienced these, and I think they have a seat at the leadership table, and they're having a dialogue with leadership about how not, like I said, just to respond to what Democrats are doing, but to be an active participant in helping to advance an agenda around women's issues, not just derivative of the presidential election, but more importantly, because it's important to the women voters and it's important to Republican women as well.
Will that trickle down, though, this thinking? Because I'm wowed, and I agree with Sam that I'm like, wow, maybe you should enter the race.
That's right.
I wonder if this is going to trickle, this kind of thinking and thoughtfulness is going to trickle into the people that you're putting forth for the presidency in the Republican Party. Is there a candidate that's there that is echoing kind of this thoughtfulness and open posture around?
Well, I think that, it's interesting because you hear the obvious choices of sort of Carly Fiorina and her dialogue, having been a CEO of a major corporation. I think her acknowledgement that focusing on issues like equal pay or paycheck fairness or paid leave are not necessarily her top priorities, but I think in the context of the umbrella conversation around allowing women greater opportunities to advance and advancement opportunities, it sounds like a pander, but I think at the end of the day, building policies in that area are things that we can do that still, again, to Sarah's point, play in that space of engaging women while not necessarily compromising our values with respect to increasing mandates and imposing burdens on businesses.
And Jen, if I could add to that, I think what we're experiencing here is because, again, Democratic women represent 30%, right, on that side of the aisle. Republican, only 6%. We need to fix that. You need to run. And so I think what we're seeing is a delayed response, right? They're getting there. It's just taking them longer because it takes longer for 6% to get their voices heard. But now, obviously, there's a big electoral win if they do.
All right.
So I think it's a combination.
Fascinating. And remember, you heard it here first. Behind the headlines, women in theater, despite making up the majority of the theater-going public, women playwrights, producers, and theater managers are hard to find. Now there's a festival designed to redress that imbalance.
More than 50 professional theaters in the Washington, D.C. area are hosting the Women's Voices Theater Festival. Each company will produce a world premiere production of a work written, at least in part, by a female playwright.
We wanted to shine a spotlight on Washington as a real destination for the arts. And when the theaters got together, we decided one of the most important things we could do is make a statement about the need for parity in theaters in America today.
Maggie Boland is the managing director of Signature Theater, one of 7 theaters that originated the festival.
There's now more than 50 world premieres by female playwrights being produced during September and October.
And I have to say, it is so astounding that this is the first time this has happened in this nation.
While women buy more theater tickets than men, only about a fifth of all plays produced are written by women.
Washington does a little better. We're a little north of 30%, but we all realize that's just not good enough. Women are half the population, and therefore they should be represented more equally on our stages.
Margaret Engel, with her twin sister Allison, wrote one of the plays to premiere at the festival, Irma Bombeck, at Wits End.
Irma Bombeck was the largest circulated newspaper writer in America. She was in over 900 newspapers with her column called At Wits End. This was a woman who was a megaphone for the ignored moms.
It's not the first time the Engels have worked together.
It makes the process a lot faster. We don't have to be excessively polite with each other. We know when something's going to work or not work.
The Engels have made it as playwrights, but a common obstacle women playwrights encounter is that producers choose to go with artists they already know, mostly men, instead of new talent.
There's been a bias in our field toward producing works with track records, which means it's a catch-22, that if men's works are getting produced more, then we can look at their track records more, and their plays are more likely to make their way into the seasons of the institutions around town.
There are already plans in place to expand the festival concept across the country.
This is not going to be a one-time festival and have business go back to usual. It is really a cosmic change.
The conversation inside our theater has changed forever. And that's what we really hope is going to happen, that 5 years from now, we're going to be able to look back and say, with this festival, we launched 50 plus female playwrights, their works out into the world.
So I'm wondering, Danielle, if this will send a shout out the way Patricia Arquette's speech when she collected her award really shook Hollywood to its foundations, saying, you know, we're not making what the men are, we deserve equal pay. Will this festival have the same effect for women in theater?
I hope that it has the same effect, and I think that it should. At the end of the day, women's voices should be heard, and I think that this is an opportunity to do so, but it always will come back to money and who wants to back them.
We're working on the political side to increase women's exposure and to increase that pipeline of women and their opportunities, and I think it's just as important on the cultural side as well, and where we have opportunities to expand that, it's even more critical than ever.
And can we do anything, since women buy most tickets, don't you think women should know this and they would be prompted
No, women drink as much sexist groundwater as men do.
All right, we're done. I'm sorry. That's as much time as we have. That's it for this edition. Please follow me on Twitter and visit our website, pbs.org/tothecontrary. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, see you next week. Keep going, Sarah.